So your new book, It's Only Temporary, is your second volume of autobiography. Not unlike Barack Obama, you've now have two volumes, which you've written yourself.
Yeah, thankfully, thankfully I haven't been mocked as much for writing two as some people have mocked him. But I suppose not thankfully. I think his have sold a lot more copies than mine have.
Now let's walk through a quick bio leading up to your first book, Time on Fire, because people may not know about it. You were born in New York.
Born in the New York area, grew up in the Hudson Valley, moved into Manhattan when I was 17 to pursue an acting career. Was doing well, had done a few leading roles in feature films, went to the Juilliard School, had appeared on Broadway several times already.
Dropped out to be in a movie with some unknown actors.
Yeah, unknown actors like Tom Cruise and Sean Penn.
What happened to those guys?
They're asking the same thing about me, it's funny. And at 24 years old, I was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia and told that it was incurable.
And you then had really a rough several years, and you wrote a book called Time on Fire, which is like an angry letter. I mean, when I once a year I get into a fight with some company, and I find often that actually just saying what happened is indictment enough, and that's kind of the way I felt reading your book.
Well, I mean, it was written for a number of reasons, not just to spew. I found myself disappeared, fighting a covert war behind, pretty facades. And my outrage was partly to have my life nearly stolen at 24 years old, but even more so that I felt surviving the incurable illness, or the supposedly incurable illness, was made even more difficult than it needed to be. And I experienced treatment within 200 miles of each other at centers that had completely different institutional personalities. And I wanted to write a brand name specific book stating the differences and asking the question, how can such different care exist?
And I think that's what was most striking in the book, is that you realize it doesn't have to be this way.
No, it doesn't have to be that way.
That you can have great care, and it doesn't, and not only if you have cancer, but also you talk about in your new book the excellent care your wife received when you were delivering your child.
Time on Fire to me is two things. It's a survival adventure story like John Krakauer's Into Thin Air, but it also contains all the information that an instruction manual would contain, although in a survival adventure story, about how to stand up for yourself, how to get the kind of care you need. And to me, the book, it goes beyond medical. It's really a question about our society, of why is mediocrity encouraged and sometimes demanded as opposed to excellence. When I found myself in a situation where it was clear that only the most excellent performance would allow me to survive, I was still told, don't make waves, don't make us work any harder, and all those kinds of things that we're used to seeing at a bank or an auto mechanic. But it's really shocking to see that the same thing exists when your life is on the line.
And the reverse, if some of the patients are not going to survive, aren't they at least entitled to a better standard of care? I thought that was also striking, because you mentioned some of the other patients. Now, in the book, you also have several New Age experiences, which you go through, which were part of your process. And how do you feel about those today?
Wow, I'm really long past them. I mean, the book Time on Fire is about going through it once in a very optimistic way and having a recurrence of the illness, and then insisting on going through it without investing in any of those sort of positive attitudes. It became a mission of mine to prove that you could go through it and survive without feeling good about your situation. I've tended in both books to write Hallmark stories in the most un-Hallmark way possible.
I think that's a good way of putting it.
I'm a fan of the understory, the story that you haven't heard told about a commonly told story.
Well, here's a quote from you. So, as an actor, my mission was to show people the truth they'd rather not confront. That's apparently your mission as a writer, too.
And in fact, I've probably been able to accomplish it more as a writer, because oddly, the niche that I've opened up, at least to most people as an actor, has been comedic. Early on, I think I was known for more dramatic roles on stage, but the wide audiences know me more as a comedic actor, probably.
And I thought one of the other important points that you had to make was that having cancer is not a good thing, even if it leads to being a better person as a result.
Yeah, I have a real strong but subtle difference that I say with the people who say this is the best thing that ever happened to me. To me, I would gladly skip the experience, go back and do it over without it. But since it happened, I certainly have mined it for all it's worth and have tried to use myself and my history in whatever positive ways are possible. That doesn't make me think that that's why it happened or that it's a good thing that it happened.
Right. And this is not to compare the two by any stretch of the imagination, but I feel the same way about the teaching of the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
I think you don't say this was, that it was a good thing or that there was a reason or that
Right.
it's a teaching lesson. Here's what happened.
Right, right.
And now, how do we go on? Now, in it, you also mentioned that about the people visiting you.
Mm-hmm.
And I also wanted to just mention that briefly, that you have a friend, Daniel, who visits you. And, in Jewish tradition, there's a thing, visiting the sick, and how much comfort that gave you is something that people don't really appreciate, I think.
Yeah, look, I, had a tremendous support network back then. I was in my mid-20s and had a very large group of friends. I was well known in the New York theater community. And Daniel, you mentioned, is a friend who used to actually come and sing at my bedside. So I'm incredibly grateful to those people. I mean, I go on to say in the book, actually, that I view my life as a tremendous community project.
Mm-hmm.
That I have my life because other people poured some of theirs into me, literally, because of the blood transfusions that I got.
Well, that's a lovely thing to say. And then you tried to be a volunteer and were rejected.
Well, years later, the new book, It's Only Temporary,
Yeah.
is about the year since the illness.
Right.
And I suppose the non-hallmark element of that one is it's about a guy who takes a very long time to shed the anger and loss that he feels over those lost years and find his way to a real deep contentment and gratitude, which you might automatically think would be what someone would emerge feeling. I did. One of the stories tells about revisiting one of the hospitals that I was treated in 13, 15 years earlier, and really questioning my perspective and memory of what I experienced then and the material in Time on Fire. And
Turns out you were right.
Trying to become a volunteer and having a wonderful experience, and then getting home, and by the time I got home, there was a telephone message saying that I was not welcome to be a volunteer because of what I'd written years before.
Talk about rejection. But It's Only Temporary is also about growing up in a way.
Absolutely.
In the first book, Time on Fire, you have a quote, "And I will never grow so old again," by Van Morrison.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, this book is actually about not so much growing old, but I've survived. Now, how do I become a man, a husband, a father?
Time on Fire is about managing to keep life from slipping away. And It's Only Temporary is about, I think, catching up to my place in life. Because what happened is I spent my 20s really reduced to the state of an old man near death, and was suddenly set free around 30 to try to live my 20s in my 30s, which is why you really get the story of so many bumbles and stumbles through romance and dating.
Right.
Because, the story that I tell is about my 27 breakups that were spread over only 10 relationships. And what you have there is a guy who really doesn't know whether he needs to grab everything he can when he can, or whether the future is something that can be trusted and invested in. And eventually it leads to a really tremendous, wonderful marriage and relationship and the birth of a child whose existence, statistically speaking, is even less likely than my own, and someone who really has invested in life and put down roots and decided that in spite of the knowledge of mortality, life is worth investing in and is having a good time as a result.
Well, when I read about all the dating and breakup, I said to myself, turns out he's Hank Moody.
It's really interesting that in my own
Hank
life,
Moody is a character
on Californication. Yeah, my own life has probably been closer to Hank Moody's than the characters that I've played, but the rules and regulations of Hollywood being what they are, those aren't the roles that I would get to play on film or television.
I know, but it's ironic. I mean,
it is. Yeah,
I had that moment, and particularly, I mean, you actually are an author.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
right.
So that was kind of funny to notice. In meeting your wife, what I also thought was interesting was you tell, the good story, that meeting your wife everyone has a story about meeting their spouse, and you tell your story. But what I found was also interesting was that sometimes it's the bad breakups that you dwell on, and the person that you end up marrying. I don't know if you know, there's a book called A Dance to the Music of Time by Anthony Powell, but it's sort of a lightweight Proust in a way. It's 12-volume series, and it takes a bunch of friends from their 20s to their 60s, and he spends one whole novel on a breakup.
Right.
And then the next novel begins, the next time I saw this woman, I was with my wife.
Mm-hmm.
And to some extent, that's sort of how life is, that you transition to the person you find completely.
Well, I cover all 27 breakups in one chapter because I don't think anybody wants to hear that much about my breakups. And meeting my wife, I think a close quote from the book is that what happened is, upon meeting my wife, everything in my life that had seemed like a terrible mistake to that point was suddenly transformed into a series of very savvy choices.
How so?
Well, because all the things that I had regretted, all the breakups, were actually what led me to the right relationship.
Right.
And it was actually the patience and the holding out that paid off. So,
and she seemed an unlikely person for you to end up with.
Absolutely unlikely. I mean, one of the major points of the book and the way I've written it the way I have and structured it the way I have is that I wanted it to be an examination of perspective, because perspective is something that requires the luxury of time, which is what I, at one point, wasn't supposed to have.
Right.
And it takes time to be able to find the right place and to be able to look back and think, oh, those things that I regret that I thought were the right place that I missed or misbehaved actually weren't the right place. And if I hadn't lived this long, I would never have gotten to know that.
Now, the book is also funny. I mean, we should let people know it's very
Absolutely,
funny.
Yeah. That's why I'm trying to get in the bit about the 27 breakups.
And one of the funnier things was the differences between Italian, your wife's Italian,
Yes.
between Italian cultural sensibilities and American. Yeah. There's a very funny thing where you're sort of dismissing an actress for getting where you say, she got a role because of her breasts.
Right.
And your wife, rather than seeing this as an insult, thinks you're complimenting.
Yeah. Well, the Italians are disgusted by the absence of American bidets.
Yes. Well,
they don't approve of our anal hygiene. And when you get right down to it...
I suffered through that chapter.
And examine it, and I don't mean, examine it microscopically, but they've got a good point. As my father said, washing is cleaner than not washing. I did compliment. I said, look, this actress got another movie made on the basis of her magnificent breasts. And my wife's response was, oh, if you think she has such magnificent breasts, why don't you go and be with her?
Right, which is actually the exact opposite of what, it's sort of like
I just wanted to be in her movie. Right. I didn't want to have anything to do with her
And it's sort of
breasts.
like that old, Rodney Dangerfield type joke where someone says to a woman, oh, you're dressed like a hooker, and she says, really? Mm-hmm. It's like she took it as like, oh, really, you like those breasts?
Right.
So, you've actually now spent some time in Italy and discovered that actually maybe they do some things right.
Yeah, it's again the question of perspective. I mean, that piece talks about how I've gotten to view American culture through the eyes of the Italians. And look, we were sitting on the couch just the other night, and when a politician gives a concession or acceptance speech and talks about the United States as being undeniably the greatest nation on earth, when I'm sitting with my wife and my Italian mother-in-law, it's difficult not to see it through their eyes as the insult that is to the rest of the world, who have every reason to believe that their nation is the moral and philosophical and technological equal of the United States.
And that we have things to learn from each other.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, as you mentioned a few moments ago, you have this miracle of getting pregnant not once but twice, which seemed incredible.
It's inexplicable, really. I have been told that my fertility capabilities are severely compromised, and yet my wife and I managed to get pregnant very quickly, and we have a beautiful 22-month-old baby girl, Sophia Clementina, who so far only speaks Italian.
Her first word wasn't agua, like all the other children in Los Angeles?
No. Close, but the Italian version. She seems fond of me, even though we don't converse. But I think she thinks I'm the foreign shipping clerk in the back room. I've become an immigrant in my own home, is what's happened.
Well, hopefully this will provide material for another book.
Or an updated Desi and Lucy sitcom. With the roles
there you
reversed.
go. Now, finally, as an actor, your career has been to put yourself in the service of the roles that you get. But in your books, you get to be you, or at least a version of you. And that must be very gratifying and very empowering for you, not only personally, but even, professionally.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's a great honor to be able to publish a book and to be able to issue forth into the world, a volume containing your thoughts just as you'd like to say them. although we don't have to make it too big a diversion, I'm always stunned at the distance actually between exactly what an author might like to say and the compromises that can sometimes be made in editorial processes. I think people are much more aware of that in terms of film and television than they are in book and magazine publishing. Yeah. I've said to magazine editors at different times, I've said, you should really publish a before and after issue so your readers can compare what the writer wanted to write versus what the magazine was willing to publish and see which your readers like better.
Well,
but I won't make many friends saying that.
And hopefully this interview was the uncut version.